Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the big issues for 2023 and beyond, the Pearson Center's first webinar of the new year. My name is Indira Naidu-Harris, and I'm today's host. I am also the Associate Vice President for Diversity and Human Rights at the University of Guelph, a former Ontario Cabinet Minister, national broadcaster, and an advisory board member for the Pearson Center for Progressive Policy. The Pearson Center, as you know, is a leading progressive think tank that addresses the challenging economic and social issues of the day. We are proud to say that we are the only think tank which invites representatives from all 5 federal parties, along with top business, labor, and civil society leaders and experts. As we like to say, we bring people and ideas together. And that's exactly what we're doing today as we look at the big issues for 2023 and beyond. You see, while it's still early in the new year, this year feels different. Our world, our lives, our families, and our communities have been ripped apart by the COVID-19 pandemic, and things are just not quite the same. There's a tension and uncertainty in the air that's troubling, unsettling, and even alarming. No question, this is an important moment in time, and this is an important conversation about how we can move forward together and solve some of Canada's biggest challenges. You see, we are all witnessing a series of disturbing crises right now that's putting us all to the test. A public health crisis, social isolation, inequality, inflation, climate change, food shortages, and even war. The list goes on. And our federal government needs to address these urgent policy issues all at once while working with various levels of government. Not so easy. Given these uncertain times, our expert panel today will discuss the main public policy issues facing Parliament this year, what has to be addressed immediately, and the actions needed. This is a vital conversation for Canadians, and I can't wait to hear what our amazing panelists have to say. So let's get started. But first, I want to start by recognizing that the Pearson Center is on the traditional lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and we welcome our speakers and audience who are joining us from across Turtle Island. Our format today is as follows. We have an hour-long session that will be divided into about 40 or 45 minutes of discussion, and that will be followed by questions from all of you, the audience. So please send any questions you would like to ask our panel through the question box, and we will get to as many as possible. We will end at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Now, we have an absolutely terrific panel for you today. 4 amazing Canadians who work in various fields and are on the ground addressing some of these urgent challenges in different ways. Our panelists today are Jim Stanford, an internationally recognized economist and director of the Centre for Future Work. Jim is one of Canada's best-known economic commentators and has served for over 20 years as economist and director of policy with Unifor. Jim is quoted frequently in print and broadcast media and is a regular columnist for the Toronto Star. Also here today is Megan Leslie. Megan is the president and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund Canada. Prior to joining WWF, Megan was a member of Parliament and represented Halifax for 2 terms. A passionate environmentalist, Megan took on the role of environment critic for the official opposition. She is a senior policy fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the U of T. Brian Gallant is the CEO of Space Canada, advisor at the Canadian Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation. He's also the former Premier of New Brunswick, who understands change in this age of innovation and disruption, as well as the challenges and opportunities created by the intersection of government, politics, business, social justice, media, and the protection of the environment. Our moderator today is also a Pearson Board member, Professor Jonathan Calof of the Telfer School of Management at OttawaU. Jonathan is also an international expert on foresight and competitive intelligence, and a UNESCO Professor co-chair of Anticipatory Systems for Innovation and New Ventures. He will take our panelists through the various issues today, the economy, the environment, and politics. It's politics. It's going to be an amazing discussion. And so now, over to you, Jonathan.
Indira, thank you so much for the introductions. I will tell you that your broadcasting experience and political experience were evident in that intro, and you've now got a moderator and 3 panelists quaking that we're going to have a hard time following that act. They're all agreeing. Thank you very much for your commitment as well to Pearson. The Pearson Center is important. The timing of today's webinar really couldn't be better because there's a 3-day cabinet retreat that is occurring as they develop as they develop the agenda for the big challenges in the session ahead. I'm not saying they're going to listen to us, but this is a good time. It's also a great time because the last webinar we had, which was in November, actually this is a second part to that. In that one, we looked at what are the big challenges. 3 prominent experts talking about what they thought it should be for next year and beyond. And that created a list that included many of the things that Indira talked about. So we've got on the table a lot of issues that have been identified by people that we all trust, love, and respect that need to be addressed now, that deal with the future as well, and for which I'm so grateful that the 3 of you are here for this discussion. I can promise the audience one thing. We are not going to cover all the issues we want to cover. It's just not going to happen. So whatever your expectations are, I promise you we will under-deliver that. And I can also promise you that in view of the importance the Pearson Center puts to these issues, as well as you could tell from the prominent people that are participating, we're going to have seminars and webinars that are going to follow this that will deal with the challenges facing Canada. And with that, it's interesting that a lot of people have talked about the economy being the #1 issue, and it is, and we're going to get to that. And Jim, I'm going to drag you in on that one when we go there. But interesting enough, what seems to have fallen off the table, and Megan, this is to you, is the environment. It took up a back seat during most of the COVID discussion for whatever reason. What are the priorities? What do you think needs to be done? And did it actually become less of a priority?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, everything became less of a priority. I don't know what your experience was of the early days of the pandemic, but I was glued to the radio and my phone at the same time, just wanting to get the latest news on what COVID-19 even was. Then, of course, my attention and many who are watching, we followed the murder of George Floyd and the outcry after that. And also the discovery of bodies at residential schools. I mean, there's been a series of things that have really rightfully captured our attention. And I would say that environment has been on the back burner attention-wise, but it certainly hasn't been on the back burner intention-wise or the way that we're working on it. I mean, I can tell you I work at World Wildlife Fund. Across this whole sector, we've continued to do work on these issues. So a lot has happened in the past few years. And I think if you even look at the Conference of Parties, the COP15 that happened in Montreal, there's a global biodiversity framework. I think it's quite good. There's some really good commitments in there. Canada was actually at the forefront of a lot of that. But wow, that biodiversity framework, we couldn't have had it 5 years ago. We couldn't have had it in part because we didn't fully understand some of these issues. We didn't understand how biodiversity was linked to climate. We didn't understand, those of us in mainstream conservation didn't really do the work we needed to do about Indigenous-led conservation and how we can marry Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science with the best of what Western science has to offer. So we've been doing that work. And you know, I think I said 5 years ago we wouldn't have had an agreement like this, maybe even a year ago, right? Like a lot of stuff is coalescing. And so even though it may not be front and center in the zeitgeist or in public communications, good work is being done. And that's why we get things like in 2021, we had a nature budget. with billions of dollars for nature and nature-based climate solutions. That's why we have a successful framework coming out of COP15. So there's good stuff happening.
And so, Megan, I'm going to turn it over to Brian next, because I know you've got some comments on this. What do you see now as the most urgent challenges, given all the good work you talked about that's been done?
Execution. So we did, like I said, there was a really good federal budget here in Canada 2 budgets ago. We do have this biodiversity framework that talks about things like restoration, which was never on the agenda before, that centers the rights of Indigenous peoples in the work that needs to be done. So it is execution. You know, when the framework came out and I did some interviews and people are like, but what about getting it done? And it's like, hey, just let us celebrate for a minute, just like a second of saying, yeah, we did it. It's mid-January, so I'm gonna turn and say it is about execution. The money is there in Canada for a lot of this work. Getting it out the door is a policy issue, I think, that the feds need to address. You know, how do we actually do this? The actual shovels in the ground. I can't believe I'm saying shovels in the ground, but you know, we're planting trees. So execution is a big part of it, and creating space in this work to ensure that Indigenous communities are able to lead in this work and guide this work. I think that's where we got to focus our attention here in Canada right now.
Yeah, and what, Megan, what I like about what you're saying is, you know, we call today's session Urgent 2023. So what you've given us, Megan, is something that can be done right now. And I like that you said the money is there. So, you know, again, if they're listening in Hamilton, we've got a priority. Brian, yeah, there we go. But we're going to all be digging. I hope you can all tell this is going to be a bit informal. I'm even doing it with first names. If Brian, if you want me to call you by your official title, I'm so happy to do, but I know that's not you.
Brian works very well. I've been called a lot worse than that, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, well, I'm not the opposition, so we're good. We're good. Brian, what do you have anything you want to add to what Megan said?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you, Jonathan, for doing this. It's an honor to be here with Megan and Jim, and very much look forward to participating and adding as much value as I possibly can with very clearly 2 experts in important fields, given the urgent issues that we'll be discussing. So, look, I'll add this. Interestingly, when you think about joining a discussion of urgent matters, urgent issues, the list that you could put is pretty long. And then to try to prioritize it and try to think, okay, well, what would you say are the most important, most urgent? What kind of focus would you have on each of them, and which ones would you focus more on? And you know what? I take a step back to help me think about that. And it's interesting. I've been very lucky in my life to do some fascinating things. And back in 2019, I started a project for an NGO called Global Canada, where we interviewed 60 business leaders, executives, and 30 thought leaders in the space of what is the role of business and society. And when we asked them what the largest challenges facing the world was back in 2019, 2020, the responses were essentially climate change and the protection of the environment, inequality and inequity as number 2, most frequently named. Lack of social cohesion, lack of trust, sort of mistrust would have been 3rd. And then in the case of the business leaders and thought leaders, we also had Indigenous reconciliation in Canada and Canada's place in the world. But let's, for the purpose of my point, let's talk about the first 3 for a sec. Then with the Canadian Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation, the organization I joined, looking at the same topic, there was some polling done, and it was actually done fairly early into the pandemic. And it was, what are the most pressing issues? Like, what's keeping you up at night? Not the exact phrasing of the polling, but essentially that was it. And again, climate change and the environment, inequality and inequity, social cohesion and lack of trust, mistrust was there. A little less prominent maybe with the public, but nevertheless it was there. So to me, it's like those are the 3 challenges that are urgent and super important. And then the list that we would all garnish on the side of our desk right now, if we were listing off challenges that we have, they fall into those 3 buckets. And I think what I would argue is they're also very interconnected. Our ability to fight climate change will depend on our ability of addressing inequality and inequity. Some of the challenges that we have of fighting climate change will stem from the fact that there's inequality and inequity. the trust that is needed to have the changes that we need to embark on, we need that third major challenge to be addressed as well, the lack of trust and social cohesion. So I think one piece I hope that I can add of value here is the fact that really these are three challenges that have been on the radar now for years, for business leaders, thought leaders, and even the public. And again, I can't stress enough, during the pandemic, those were the words and those were the things that were coming out of the public, even though we were in the midst of a pandemic, right? They weren't, healthcare made the list, but it wasn't in the top three. And the economy, purely speaking, made the list, but it wasn't in the top three. The other three were really the ones that people were focused on. And then to the specific question of whether climate change kind of took a back seat, Megan, I think, is obviously very well placed to answer that question. I mean, the only thing I would add is I think it goes back again to kind of the macro issue that climate change is one of those things that's not as in our face as maybe some of the other challenges are on a daily basis. Unfortunately, it's in our face a bit more than it was before. That's for sure. With the more severe and more frequent weather issues and extreme weather that we're seeing over the last few years and months, the no question that it's more in our face than it's ever been, and unfortunately will continue to do that, and that's the trend we will see. It is still one of those that's not as evident, right? As somebody that's going about trying to make their, make the week, make the day, pay their bills, inflation, cost of living, inequality, it's in your face a bit more, right? So that's a very important challenge to fight, there's no question. And I think if you ask a lot of parliamentarians, what's probably urgent for them is cost of living and inflation, because that's kind of what is coming back to them on a sort of daily and weekly basis from constituents and Canadians. But no doubt that climate change is the most urgent issue when you take it in the relevance of importance, but they're interlinked again. And the last point I'll make is the World Economic Forum with their top risks. I think explains very well the way that probably a lot more articulate than I trying to communicate this, but essentially it said cost of living and affordability was the most urgent issue for the next 2 years. But then when you looked at the risks and issues for the next 10 years, the top 10 was, I think, don't quote me on the number, but I think it was like 6 or 7 of them were all about the environment. So it became very clear that the long-term most urgent issue is definitely climate change and other challenges facing environmental protection. But then the World Economic Forum did well to also point out, but we also recognize cost of living, inflation, affordability is probably what's top of mind for most Canadians, and in the case of the World Economic Forum, people around the globe.
I like, Brian, that you've reinforced what Megan said about the interlinkage between environment and other issues as well. And so, Megan, you did a good job in terms of the Indigenous and quality. Brian, you brought up other dimensions. It's too complex just to say, here's an environment vote, here's an Indigenous vote. This is, anyways. So that brings me to you, Jim. I'm going to ask you obviously there's got to be an economic spin and tie-in when we talk about the environment being an important issue that needs to be addressed. So, if you're comfortable, talk a bit about the economic side, and then I'm going to hit you with the big economic question.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I'm on board completely with what Megan and Brian just said. They are all linked together. The big term, that became very common, I don't know if it was the word of the year for the Oxford Dictionary or not, I can't remember, but it's polycrisis. Polycrisis was the big word of 2022, and it's precisely trying to sum up that, stuff is happening all over the place, and it is connected. And certainly the environmental challenges and the economy absolutely connected. I mean, we've known for ages that we were paying the economic cost of climate change right now, absolutely, with severe weather and droughts and floods and the shifts in food production, et cetera, et cetera. But we're literally paying for it when we go to the grocery store now. That's absolutely clear. Food inflation running around 12% in Canada, and it absolutely is linked to, among other factors, these repeated climate disasters that have affected food production and food supply. And you can't just say they're one-off events. This is kind of the new normal now. And so maybe that will, if we can get the narrative out there to show that climate change is part of this polycrisis and we have to address it, that will help. Same goes on the energy side. There's been no bigger single contributor to the surge in inflation last year than on energy prices. If we had been faster and stronger in rolling out renewable energy, we wouldn't be under the thumb of OPEC plus when they take advantage of the latest geopolitical crisis to jack up oil prices, and that's what's happened. So all kinds of very, very tangible ways, Jonathan, that we're paying an economic cost, an economic price every day at the grocery store, the gas pump, and everything else that we do. And that hopefully will concentrate the minds of both voters and our leaders that we have to keep moving ahead and coming up with good policies, and as Megan says, executing those policies.
Yeah, and from what the three of you are saying, it's that it needs to be an integrated policy. In fact, from what you're talking about, I look at the top issues that we got in November. Every one of them can be linked to environment. Even future jobs can be linked to environment. Brian, even what you do with space technologies can be linked. So I think it's very interesting that, what we're all saying is, at the cabinet table, guys, please get together, talk about how your department contributes to. So it's an interesting challenge. And then Jim, I want to also push you more on the economy, and I'm going to start off with the end point, which is if you were advising the next 3 days the cabinet, what would you say are the biggest issues economically, and what should they be doing? And the general view is that this is due to COVID. This too shall pass. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, housing shortage, spike in cost of living, and inflation. So there's a lot of discussion about that. These are the factors, most of which we can't do anything about. Jim, how are you seeing it economically, and what would you be telling PMO and cabinet to do?
Right. Well, in a way, those two different questions, Jonathan. What's happening with the economy, and what can the PMO and cabinet do about it? PMO and cabinet are very important players in our economy. Don't get me wrong. On the other hand, when Pierre Poilievre comes out and says everything that's wrong in the world is Justin Trudeau's fault, it's nonsense. Canada's inflation, for example, is actually at the low end of the range of inflation that's been experienced around the world. And if Prime Minister Trudeau somehow caused inflation to break out in Europe and Latin America, that would be a real testament to his power. So there really is, in a way, limits on what the federal government can and can't do about this. Interesting, the cabinet's meeting in Hamilton. There's another meeting happening this week. That's tomorrow in Ottawa. The Bank of Canada's policy committee is going to meet and decide on the next interest rate decision. And most economists, myself included, expect them to pull the trigger again on an 8th increase in interest rates. That will take their policy rate to 4.5%, most likely. And I think the year ahead is, last year was dominated by the surge in inflation globally, not just in Canada. This year will be dominated by the consequences of the response to the surge in inflation. So in a way, it's a sequel to what we've seen. Almost certainly, we're going to see a recession of some kind in Canada and most other industrial countries as the economies adjust to high interest rates and the slowdown in spending power that interest rates are designed to accomplish. The question is it going to be a pause, a soft landing as folks hope for? That's what the Bank of Canada hopes for. Or is it going to repeat history? The other times in history when we've increased interest rates this much and tried to bring down the inflation rate this much, were always associated with a major recession, the sort of painful downturn that takes 6 to 8 quarters to work itself through, that would see the unemployment rate in Canada rise to something like 9% likely in my forecast. So I tend to think that harder landing is more likely. And in that case, what the federal cabinet needs to think about is what is the government's role in a moment like that. I think so far the government has followed a fairly balanced approach coming out of the COVID. They've unwound the emergency support programs that were so essential to getting us through, but they have also avoided the extremes of sort of knee-jerk austerity that we've seen in some other jurisdictions where governments get more obsessed with their budget balance than with the state of the people they govern, which is a big mistake. And we've seen some limited targeted supports for people, low-income Canadians and others trying to grapple with the cost of living. The GST credit, very good idea. The expanded Canada Housing Benefit, a very good idea. I think we're going to need more of that. We're going to have to look at the employment insurance system. EI proved that it was broken when COVID hit. That's why we had to have CERB and all those other programs, because EI was not up to the task. Now we've got a consultation process, but we're back to pre-COVID EI rules right now. And that is going to hammer people who need help if, in fact, we enter a recession. So I would put reforming EI at the top of the cabinet's agenda. We're also going to need continued, I think, fiscal support from government. We've had very rapid downsizing of government spending with the phase out of the COVID payments. Fair enough, but now we're actually in a situation where the federal government, believe it or not, has run a surplus in the first 7 months of this fiscal year, which is gobsmacking to people. And again, just puts the lie to this fake news out there that the inflation was caused by rampant deficits. We don't even have a deficit. We actually have a surplus right now. That may not last to the end of the fiscal year, but it's shocking how quickly the budget balance has been repaired. And that gives the government plenty of room to maintain support for public programs. Healthcare obviously is top of mind to people right now, but other public programs and investments in infrastructure. The things we were just talking about, environment, energy, sustainable energy infrastructure, housing, which was an enormous contributor to the inflationary surge. Those all need massive resources from the public side of the economy. And we have to keep those coming. The arguments for them are all the stronger as the economy enters a recession. We need them especially at that time. So hopefully the cabinet is thinking, you know, we'll hope for the soft landing. If we don't get it, government's got a role to play, and I hope they're up to it.
Terrific. Brian, Jim has just given us a really good overview and picture in all the areas. What did he say that concerned you the most, and what is the recommendation you're going to make?
What concerns me the most is that no political party jotted all that down for a platform. I thought Jim basically rattled off a pretty good federal platform. I think Jim's bang on, and obviously who would I be to say the contrary? He's obviously an expert in the field, and I think what really resonated with me is that he confirms what Megan and I put out there, the idea that all of these things are connected. And to me, when he was listing off some of the things that he thought were working well and some of the things that would be helpful, I was reminded of an approach that we would take at times in government, and certainly one that I might submit as an addendum to Jim's platform that he just rattled off. Finding things that, given these challenges are so interconnected, can help address more than one challenge is always a good thing, but especially when we have the poly crisis, as Jim put out there, we would, I think, benefit greatly from those types of policies. So just quick examples that come to the top of my mind. Investments in public transit. Well, it's infrastructure. You're creating jobs with the injection of investment that you might be making. If it's done right, it can be a way in which we're reducing the emissions from transportation. It can be a way in which you're helping commute times for those that may be struggling with getting into some of the major cities. It's a way that you can help the employers in the major cities and frankly all cities and communities across the country, but especially when you look at major cities. So it's just one of those, and many more benefits, but it's just one of those that it has 3-4 benefits that happen to be addressing the 3 buckets that I would submit are the major challenges, and not to put words in the mouths of Jim and Leslie and Megan, but I think also they pointed out to these challenges. So I think these 3 buckets could be addressed with a policy like that. Another one that I really always like to see is energy efficiency, helping people with their houses, be it that in their homes, that much more energy efficient. A stimulus helps create some jobs when we're expecting a potential downturn. It helps people conserve energy, obviously helping climate change, and then it helps them pay less in heating bills, right, and electricity bills. So it's just one of those that has, again, quite a few benefits that are very directly linked to trying to address the buckets of challenges, the urgent issues that we're talking about. So thinking of those, I think would be good if I were to add to the platform that's being developed here. And of course, then also doing the best they can to communicate with Canadians. And that's going to be crucial. I worry, to your point, Jonathan, what would you worry about? I would worry about the classic kind of challenge that governments and political figures, elected officials face. And it is to communicate what they're trying to do. And it's to communicate complex issues in a 10-second soundbite, and that's probably at 5 seconds now, right? We're getting smaller and smaller in terms of the space we have to explain what governments are doing and other people's points of view in the public discourse. So that worries me. That's a big concern, and it's always been a challenge, but it's increasingly so. And I think at a time when we have a poly crisis, when we have so many issues that we have to address, and again, if you take my kind of thesis that there's the big 3 buckets, but tons of issues within those buckets, and they're all interrelated, it becomes pretty hard to communicate why you're doing something, why something is important, or maybe why you're not doing something. So that worries me a lot. And I think Pearson Center and others can play a role on the peripherals of government and participate in the dialogue and discourse and try to explain why things might be happening. And of course, call people out on it, using the mechanisms, accountability and transparency, calling people out if they're not doing them for the right reasons, or they're not really focused on the urgent issues that are before us. So that would be, Jonathan, to your question, probably the biggest concern that I have. That, again, always been a challenge, but I think it's more so today, especially given the complexity and the holistic nature of the issues that we face.
Now, Brian, one of the reasons I'm smiling now.
Brian, I'll just jump in. I like your idea of a federal program. I think you, me, and Megan, we could be quite the triumvirate there. And I know what position I put you in, Brian.
I love it. And Brian, not only were you insightful, you kind of took over my role. And Megan, that means since he cited your name, since he tied in with your side, last word on this goes to you on the economy.
Thanks. I have not heard this term poly crisis before, so thanks for that, Jim. And immediately, I was thinking, okay, so what are the poly solutions? And like what Brian and Jim have been giving these examples where there's a policy solution that addresses multiple issues at once, that is exactly the way to go. Brian, you're from New Brunswick, the St. John River, the Wollastock River, it's having a once in a century flooding incident every year, okay? So it's climate change. But if we look at how can we help communities deal with that, well, you know what? Trees absorb more water than any culvert or any breakwater or anything like that you can build. So let's look at how we do restoration. That restoration will help the individuals in these communities along the river. It also creates habitat for wildlife. It also stores carbon for climate change. I mean, that we can do this exercise, and I'm kind of laughing a little bit and making it lighthearted, but it's really freaking serious and it works. But there's this tendency to say, okay, this is our climate change piece, this is our nature piece, this is our jobs piece. Back to the idea of nature and our protection goals that we set. Okay, well, let's ask ourselves, how do we use this as an opportunity for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, right? Ask the question and do that thought exercise of how one policy can address, have the poly solutions.
And by the way, you're right, Megan, and you're right, both Jim and Brian. These issues are too complex to leave to one department, and quite frankly, to just the government. So I love the complexity you're bringing up. It fits with a lot of other areas. It's interesting that I have an agenda, and I could actually back out because each one of you has brought in each other and elements of the agenda. And Jim, I'm not asking you this question yet, but Jim mentioned that with this issue and the other issues, you have unfortunately, the polarization in Canada, which is growing. And I love what you said, Jim, about, it's not Justin Trudeau that caused inflation. If he could be credited with dealing with, creating it in Europe, then he's an more amazing guy than people think he is. And I think you're right. And I have, Brian and Megan, I got two very successful politicians in this area. So I'm gonna start with you, Brian, with you. This polarization has become an issue that's interfering with the programs and policies that we're now talking about. What is happening there, and what can we do about it?
I could go on a rant here for quite a long time, but I'll sum up the view that I have. I think that there's always been some version of polarization in society, but it is more prevalent now for, I think, the main reason being that we have social media that would be doing a lot of things at once that are maybe unintended consequences. I'm not going to spend time on the power of social media. There's some good there. It's like any tool. It can be used to connect us and inform us in ways that we could not even have dreamed of a few decades ago. So there's lots of good there, but there's also unintended consequences. And the first one I'll start with is that it's putting pressure on traditional media. So traditional media no longer has the luxury to maybe wait a few hours, let alone a few days, to really make sure they get the story right and they get as many points of view as possible, and they think through the story at hand, because it's going to be out within minutes on social media. So they're implicitly pushed to be that much quicker, which is unfortunate. And obviously there's the whole business model that I won't get into, but there's a whole business model disruption as well. Then of course we have the idea that social media can connect people, yes, but unfortunately with algorithms and with the way in which the platforms have decided to set up, maybe because it's better for their business case, it becomes more of an echo chamber than anything. We're not connecting with people that disagree with us. We're not connecting with people with different perspectives. We're connecting with people that think like us, that will sort of be an echo chamber, that will be a bubble around us of information. And we all have it. That's what's really fascinating and depressing at the same time. I mean, if you look at your channel and your feeds on your social media channels, and you really think it through and look with a critical eye, you're going to be seeing stories of things that you're interested in. I go on and I see political stories, I see stories of tennis, and I see dog videos. Well, that's a pretty pretty wide breadth of things, but it's very specific to me, I'll tell you, right? So it just goes to show that, and obviously on the more important part of that, it's on the politics. What do you think? I'm seeing things that are my views, that are things that I believe, that are even maybe specifically to the party I support, whatever it might be. So it becomes an echo chamber, and people just believe that what they think is absolutely right. There's no other points of view out there. There's no other perspectives, and then that what it does is polarize us. And I also think at the same time, we have grown a little impatient, all of us, and as groups, and we're not willing, it feels like, to compromise as much. And I'll tell you what I mean. You could join a political party, and let's say on 10 decisions on average, you agree with 7 or 8 of them. That's actually a pretty good ratio. That's pretty good. And then there'll be 1 or 2, maybe 3 that you don't agree with. And that's normal, because a political party, and then ultimately a government or opposition, whatever it might be, but essentially the political party is hundreds, thousands, millions of people, depending on the level of government and politics. So it's very normal that you're not going to agree with all the decisions, but you can still say, I agree with most, and I understand the others, just, agree to disagree, all good. It's the one I agree with the most, all that stuff. And of course, if there's a party shifts and you don't see yourself in that party anymore, there's another party that maybe has a higher ratio, certainly look into maybe that's the party for you. But now, when somebody doesn't agree, I think more so than before, if there's like an 8 on 10, that's not enough. And then on the 2 on 10, they completely lose trust in that party, in that government, in maybe politics in general. And I think it's a little bit because of the polarization and the information that they're getting. And I think that's really tough, because it's putting us all in a spot where, with the discourse, with the decision making of governments, we find ourselves basically saying, okay, well, we have people that we need to have 10 on 10s here for them to stay with us, and it's just not possible. So then all of a sudden, it's just like going to the third challenge that I mentioned. People just don't trust the institution of government and politics anymore, because they don't necessarily see themselves 10 on 10 with certain party groups. And just to give people an example, I was the premier. I was the premier who calls the consensus in cabinet, and there were things that my government did that I didn't necessarily agree with. And people will be like, well, how does that happen? Well, sometimes we would go with the caucus and the cabinet and make decisions based on the group, and it wasn't where I thought we should go, but obviously compromising. And B, sometimes ministers made decisions without having approval, because they had the authority to do so, and maybe I didn't always agree with those decisions. So even the person that's right at the center, that has ultimately the last say, as many would think, there are decisions that their government would make that they don't necessarily agree with. So that's going to have to be the case for everybody, that we accept the idea that you join and you have to compromise and stuff. So this polarization is just leaving it that people expectations are very high. Then information is either misinformation, or we're also we're in an age of disinformation, where it's not just that maybe it's the wrong information, but people are purposely putting out information to try to mislead people. And then, of course, when you see last point I'll make, whole lots of people, bunch of people that are echo chambering and in a bubble, and they have the same points of view, that are very polarized, that are misinformed, maybe disinformed as well, then you'll have somebody that comes in and says, well, I see a political opportunity here. I see an opportunity to harness that sort of anger and potentially the misinformation, disinformation that they're receiving to my political benefit. And to me, the people, unfortunately, are fed this information. So you got to sympathize with them a bit. I mean, in general, you have to say, look, like these algorithms and these platforms and these connections that they've made are not different perspectives. So they have that coming at them, and they have very real challenges, as we all do. But often the people that will be looking for the savior that has all the answers in a populist, polarized kind of movement will really put all their eggs in the basket of this person fixing all the problems. And usually it's very simple logic that they use because they want to be able to harness that anger and the misinformation and, again, disinformation that they're receiving.
Good ideas, Brian. Megan, I'll give the last word on this question to you. You are in a company, you have been in a portfolio that's got a lot of polarization across Canada. I'm going to try to be gentle on that. So last word to you on this one. Do you see that increasing, and how do we deal with it?
Yeah, it's definitely increasing. So I am at a conservation organization, an environmental group, and I get together with executive directors from other environmental organizations from time to time. And we brought in Justin Ling, who's a reporter. He really does a lot of good reporting on the rise of the right in Canada, online hate, that kind of thing. And we just asked him to present to us so we could get a better lay of the land and understand if we had any role to play. There was one thing he said. He talked about the convoy. So there's a very specific niche aspect of this issue, but he was down at the convoy in Ottawa last winter, and he was talking to people, and he said, yeah, there's a group of people there. They're racist, they're fascist, yes, but that group's quite small. And so many people he talked to, they were there for different reasons. They were tired of the mask mandates. I mean, who wasn't? They were worried about, chemicals in their food. They were worried about their health, the health of their children. They were feeling isolated. They came for different reasons, but he said the one thing they all said was, I found my people. I belong. I have this incredible feeling of belonging. And I've been thinking about what that means for me leading an environmental organization, when like those folks who are worried about chemicals in their food, they should be with us.
Yeah.
Those folks that are, interested in wellness or interested about the environment where their kids play, they should be with us. So I've been thinking a lot about the role of the organization I work at, for us to play in creating a space that is welcoming, where those folks say, oh, I found my people. Oh, this is what I want to be a part of. And taking that energy they have and taking that fear that they have and showing them how they can channel that into something productive for our society, right? Planting this, I hope this doesn't sound like too big of a leap, but like plant a native species in your backyard that will help a pollinator, that will then feed a bird, that will then disperse seeds and create more habitat. I mean, it's the cycle of life. This is how it works, just like Walt Disney said. But how do we, the Center for Future of Work, Space Canada, Pearson Center, what is our role in bringing those people, not the fascists and the racists, but those other people, bringing them in to help us in our work? I think we all.
Megan has just brought you in, Jim, which I think is great. That's why I said, what do I need to do? Megan and Brian have made it clear, and Jim, so have you throughout this, that there's kind of a need for people to work together. It's not an individual one. We've said, what should the feds be doing? I think we can all agree the feds on their own can only do so much. I think you've done a good job in terms of polarization, bringing people together. So I'm going to bring in a question now, Jim, for you to start with, which is, we're trying to get economic recovery. So what is the role, forget the feds right now, of the provincial governments, of the NGOs, of business, of labor? Jim, these are all groups that you actively worked with, consulted to, so you're in a really good position. What do they need to be doing?
Wow. Well, let's organize another 1 hour webinar on those.
I know. It's a thesis too. It's a couple theses.
Right on. Yeah. But you're right. First of all, just the premise of the question, we need to work towards economic recovery. I'm grateful for putting it that way, because lots of people think it's done and dusted. In fact, there's this argument out there, we've recovered too much and the economy is overdoing it. And this is why we have to pour a giant bucket of ice water over the Canadian economy to cool it down. And absolutely wrong. When you look at our potential, when you look at our actual GDP compared to trend pre-COVID, when you look at our productivity growth, when you look at our innovation, we are absolutely underperforming. So thank you, whoever asked the question, for putting economic recovery on the list, because we are still trying to recover. Absolutely. We have not repaired the damage from COVID, and we have more to do in all of those areas, especially innovation, investment. You know, I work in the Center for Future Work. We get all kinds of questions about, are human beings going to be all replaced by robots? You know, and we're all going to be unemployed, which is a great irony, because Canadian business has never invested less in robots and other types of machinery equipment than in its entire history. In fact, as a share of GDP, investment in machinery equipment has fallen in half since the turn of the century. So we've got lots of problems to take on, and all of the stakeholders you mentioned, Jonathan, all levels of government, not just the feds, the provinces hold the big stick in terms of public programs, education, healthcare, and others. Business, I think, has a critical role to play, and frankly has been underperforming. It's been too easy in Canada to make big money in banking, real estate development, and resource extraction. Those are the places where it's been so easy to make money, and that's where all the money is gone. And we haven't put enough attention into innovation and manufacturing and tradable services to have a balanced and successful economy. Labor, you mentioned, absolutely can and should play a role, and we should see labor as a partner in this whole process of development and inclusive development, to make sure that as we build our economy, the benefits of it are being shared. And I think that will actually help to address the polarization problem you were discussing earlier. That type of polarization breeds in a terrain where people feel excluded and a lack of opportunity. And if we can build an economy where every person, regardless of what class, where they're at on the ladder, has a vision of themselves attaining a good life for themselves and their kids, then I think that polarization is negated as well.
Very good answer. And Jim is right. We need another webinar for that. You brought up future work. We need to include that in the webinar. So I'm going to have, I'm not asking for commitments now, but I'm going to ask Sharon to reach out for part 2 or part 3 of this. Another question, and Jim recognized that was from the audience. Megan, to you on an audience question, kind of ties into what we're talking about. Where do you see Indigenous consultation for nature-based solutions for climate resiliency?
Ooh,
tough question to ask. To read.
Yeah, I'm gonna rephrase the question, which
Sure.
might not be what I'm allowed to do, but just because of that word consultation, I mean, I think it's not, we're at a point where it's not about consultation, it's about centering Indigenous rights and responsibilities in this work. And there are incredible Indigenous conservation leaders in Canada, communities that are already actively engaged, using their traditional knowledge and the best of Western science together to say, hey, this is what we need to protect and how. We're working with Inuit on the Avik Peninsula, which is the furthest north on mainland Canada. And for them, this is about food security. If they lose caribou, then they lose the ability to have access to country foods, and they lose the word tuktu, the word for caribou, which means they start to lose language, they start to lose culture. So we're taking our cues from them because they know exactly what they need. And this is an incredible opportunity to fund that work, the work of guardianship of the lands and waters that Indigenous communities have been doing for millennia, honoring that work, centering it in how we look at protection, how we look at restoration. There's an incredible opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Megan. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, and that question I'm going to ask to all 3 of you. You each have a minute on it, and I'm sure all of you will say we need a seminar on it. I love this one. What's your view on basic income? Is it worth pursuing? It kind of ties into what every one of you have been talking about. And Brian, I'm going to start with you.
I think it's definitely worth pursuing. It's one in which we already have programs that are with the principle of allowing for a social net to help people and ensure a certain quality of life. We already have those types of things. We have lots of programs that look at people's income as well. So there's I think clear picture that people like that type of policy and believe that it can work. Now, the practical parts of it that need to be figured out. How do you deal with all levels of government cooperating, collaborating to make something like that work? How do you ensure that the people are still going to be able to get other programs that may be important to them? That's always a risk when sort of, if you get one program, you don't qualify for another. So what does that look like? And all things aren't created equal when it comes to people's needs and the support that they would warrant from government to be able to have a good quality of life. And obviously the principle behind it is that they say that there shouldn't kind of be any other programs, and it should be just the one program that helps you. And I just don't know, right? Because when you have other types of programs for, say, medical costs and things, it would be one that I would argue is a bit dangerous to have as a principle.
Brian, I hate to cut you off, but that's your minute. I like it.
That's the minute, eh? Yeah. Well, it's all good. It's all good. There you go.
Jim, you're the economic view of minimum income.
Brian has touched on some of the program design issues, and he's quite right of the need to pay attention to those. Economically, of course, a big issue is how do you pay for it? I think that is absolutely doable. I think the way to get there, Jonathan, is not, a one-shot magic bullet that somehow fixes everything. I'd like to see the principle of basic income, which is no one in Canada should have to live in poverty. I'd like to see it gradually extended. We almost have it now for people over 65 with our OAS and GIS programs. Poverty is very low. We almost have it for people under 18. If you look at what's happened to child poverty rates in Canada in the last several years with the new benefit programs, it almost disappeared. It's an astounding economic and social accomplishment that doesn't get the attention that it needs. We could keep squeezing those together. I'd like to see a basic income, for example, for young adults up to age 25 to help them as they're going through school or trying to establish a career or start a business. And likewise, at the other end, eventually we'll strengthen the whole net of programs so that the goal of basic income, no one should live in poverty, is achieved.
And Jim, I like what you're saying, that we've already kind of done that for certain groups. So we're not saying do something new, unique. We're saying continue with the path. Megan, you're agreeing. So obviously last minute to you.
Yes. And we just need to make sure that we are looking at everything through an equity lens, because we know that we don't achieve justice when we treat people equally. So back to the design issues that Jim and Brian were talking about. But yes, this is something we should be looking at.
Okay, Sharon and Indira, you understand we need 4 or 5 more hours. I'm sure we can get our panelists to agree, but Indira, last word to you. And again, thank you for your incredible start for the session. Oh, you're on mute.
There we go. All right, fantastic. Listen, this has been a thought-provoking and fantastic discussion, and a really important one. And I just want to say, I returned from Davos, and the conversation about polycrises and the interconnected global family we have right now, and how all of these things are affecting our everyday lives, is exactly what you all were talking about. I was specifically interested in the notion, really, about sustainability, and whether we were talking about the environment, Megan, with you, or Brian and Jim talking about affordability and inflation and really quality of life, which is another form of sustainability and more along the lines of human sustainability. I think these are important conversations for us to be having right now. But I'm going to say to you all, for perhaps our next session and something to think about, we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about the environment, we're talking about human sustainability in terms of affordability and the economy and really housing and things like that. What about wellness, right? How does that part of sustainability fit into these conversations when we're talking about building a strong future for Canadians? And I'm going to leave that with you. That can be next time. I think it's an important conversation, whether we're talking about mental health or other things. And so maybe we'll be back to talk about 2023 and the big conversations we should be having. A big thank you to all of you, to our donors and sponsors who made today's discussion possible. Our sustaining sponsors are Canada's Building Trades Unions, AMAPSIO, Ontario's Professional Employees, LIUNA, Laborers International Union of North America. And again, thank you to all of you, our very special panelists, for an unbelievably thoughtful and thought-inspiring conversation. And Jonathan, you were an amazing moderator. You brought it all together, made it look easy, and let me tell you, I know it's not. So thank you so much for that. See you all next time. Have a great day. I hope our viewers enjoyed this. Miigwech, and until the next time, take care.
Merci beaucoup.